Genocide tag. We are an anti-genocide advocacy and litigation group based in Washington and London, and we focus primarily on genocide recognition in Sri Lanka and most importantly on genocide prevention since 2008. Now I want to talk about how the UN report strongly supports our position that Gossel, the government of Sri Lanka, has been engaged in the genocide of the Tamil people. So firstly I will go to the figures. The UN report provides 3 different estimates of Tamil civilian deaths, from 40,000 to 75 to 80,000 and 120,000, respectively based on 3 different credible methodologies. It chooses the lowest one. But most importantly, the UN report finds that most civilian casualties in the final phase of the war were caused by government shelling. Let me now go to the nature of the alleged crimes. The UN report finds credible evidence that the government of Sri Lanka committed crimes against humanity. And so I focus on 3 crimes specifically: murder, extermination, and persecution of the Tamil population of the Vani. The report also criticizes the LTT, but these criticisms, in our view, do not go towards genocide, and so I will not focus on them, but we'll take questions on that. Let me highlight the significance of the term crimes against humanity. The Rome Statute explicitly states murder, extermination, rape, persecution. Now, all of these individual crimes reach the threshold of crimes against humanity only if they're part of a widespread or systematic practice, either government policy or condoned by government or de facto authority. So in that sense, both genocide and crimes against humanity are systematic, they're intentional, and they're large scale. The difference tends to be in the intent component. So in the Genocide Convention, you have to prove intent. The intent to destroy in whole or in part, in significant part, a target population. There is also a very simple alternative academic definition, which is proposed by Martin Shaw, which is a genocide is a war against civilians. So now I want to focus on how the UN report supports the case for genocide. The report based their findings on a lot of precedents from the ICTY, the Yugoslavia Tribunal, the ICTR, the ICC statutes, and so forth. Now what the report does is it characterizes the systematic shelling of civilians and the intentional deprivation of access to food and medicine, and I quote, it says they're calculated to bring about the destruction of a significant part of the civilian population. Now this characterization is identical, is very, very similar to the definition of genocide in Article 2C on the UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. 2C, conditions calculated to bring about the destruction of the target population. So I would like to focus also on the striking parallels between the events in Mullaitivu in the last phase of the war and the genocide of Bosnian Muslims in Srebrenica, which previous speaker has alluded to also. The case law in the ICTY is the earliest case. It clearly establishes when part destruction constitutes genocide, not whole destruction of group, but part destruction. Now, Srebrenica was also a designated safe haven, encouraging civilians to concentrate there, and thereby making the mass killings that followed possible. Now, in Sri Lanka, again, the report, the UN says, I quote, the government shelled on a large scale in 3 consecutive no-fire zones where it had encouraged the civilian population to concentrate. It shelled the United Nations hub, food distribution lines, and near the ICRC ships that were coming to pick up the wounded. It shelled despite its knowledge of the impact, provided by its own intelligence systems and through notification by the UN, the ICRC, and others. Most civilian casualties in the final phase of the war were caused by this government shelling. Now, the effect of these 3 consecutive safe zones was to empty the surrounding regions, this is my words, of their population, ethnic cleansing in short, and to concentrate them in a small area for efficient killing. It meets the definition of a war on civilians, the academic definition. On the question of motive for genocide, the ICTY found that the Srebrenica was chosen because of its strategic significance for the viability of the Bosnian state. I quote from the ICTY judgment, sophisticated case, capture and ethnic purification of Srebrenica would therefore severely undermine the military efforts of the Bosnian Muslim state to ensure its viability. The elimination of the Muslim population of Srebrenica would serve as a potent example to all Bosnian Muslims of their vulnerability and defenselessness in the face of Serb military forces. Now, the exact same thing can be said of the Vani region in Sri Lanka. It had strong strategic and symbolic significance for the de facto Tamil state. And in exterminating a significant part of its population, off to deal with the Tamil people such a traumatizing blow that they would never challenge Sinhala dominance of the entire island again. Okay. Now I also want to focus on the reconstitution test for genocide, an ICTY test. The ICTY found, I'm losing my So the ICTY found basically that, let me do this from memory now. The ICTY found basically that the test is effectively one of reconstitution. If you cannot reconstitute the target population in the way that it was before the war, then that also is a critical test because it has then been destroyed in that geographic location. So that is a critical test for genocide. And so it is in view of this that we must actually look at what happened in the internment camps. Right? Because in the internment camps and the speed and what the government originally intended, how long to keep the people, and the slowness with which they brought them back. And also, of course, we must also look at the militarization and the change in population demographics. So if we ethnically cleanse, we destroy a part, and then how do we proceed about reconstitution? And if we fail in reconstitution, it makes the ICTY test. So that's another test that is important in the ICTY case. So having gone through all of these points of the similarity, of course the numbers were huge. They were very different. I mean, they're very similar in terms of population numbers, 2 million or so Muslims in Bosnia, and about the same number overall in Sri Lanka, Tamils, 2 million. But if you look at the destruction in part within the Gani region, of course it's a much bigger scale. So in summary, the UN report also, I would say that it goes towards motive because it does recognize that the Sinhala, the Sri Lanka is a state that supports the supremacy of British religion and so forth. It does recognize that the military is ethnically cleansed. It does recognize the historic context of all of the things that other speakers have spoken. The UN report goes towards that. It doesn't go as far as we would like. But I would also say that we, Tamils Against Genocide, we also, of course, we would recognize further the context, and we would say that it is very similar to pre-1942 Nazi Germany. Now I say that I know there will be a lot of reaction, but I say that because there is a racist ideology, a supremacist ideology. It's in the Sinhala nationalist ultra-Buddhist side, and the Mahavamsa book, which the current president, the symbolism of the together, the character in the book is what the current president campaign for an invention. So it's very much in the popular mind. There is legislation which has been brought up in citizenship removing legislation. There is a history of pogroms, which is clear each of those are an act of genocide and have been recognized as such. Right? So there's the destruction of culture, the destruction of libraries also in Nazi Germany. So also in Nazi Germany there is the destruction of libraries and culture, the books, the great Talmudic libraries in Poland, the Jehovah Library. There are so many similarities, structural similarities, okay? And the pogroms especially, there's a series of ethnic crimes. Already genocide has happened in Sri Lanka. How many times does it have to happen in these sporadic ways until the international community recognizes it? The International Commission of Jurists already recognized genocide in 1983. Why do we have to go through this process again now in 2009? And so for that reason I would call on the European Union, which is a major trading partner of Sri Lanka, which is a major influence on the Human Rights Council and also on the Security Council, right, to say to redress the balance of its actions in the past and to recognize that genocide has happened in Sri Lanka and that it needs to be dealt with going forward. Thank you.